Good evening. Nietzsche, Derrida. We now turn to Jacques Derrida and his essay, Éperons, les styles de Nietzsche, translated as Spurs, Nietzsche's Styles. First delivered at Cérésie in 1972, published in this form in 1978. Derrida's essay is a remarkable engagement with Nietzsche. Unlike other critical thinkers that we've read, unlike, for instance, the Foucault of 71 or the Foucault of 73, Derrida doesn't explicitly seek in Nietzsche a model for critical theory and doesn't look exegetically for a truth in Nietzsche. Yet Derrida, perhaps more than many of our other authors we've read, is deeply Nietzschean, I would say. He's perhaps one of the most Nietzschean of our critics. And it's that paradox that reveals, I think, perhaps this element of genius in this particular text. I'd venture to say that Derrida has a Nietzschean understanding of truth, but that he does not go looking for it in Nietzsche. In fact, he couldn't. Derrida would not be able to look for truth in Nietzsche, because for him to read Nietzsche or to attempt to find truths in Nietzsche would really be nothing more than commenting on the phrase, "I have forgotten my umbrella." In a beautiful essay posted online, Daniel Cohen-Levinas refers to this passage and refers to this as Nietzsche or Derrida doing philosophy not with a hammer, but doing philosophy with an umbrella. As you know, Spurs ends with that passage, which of course is one of Nietzsche's unpublished, or rather only posthumously published fragments. We find these words in a quotation mark on a manuscript on an unpublished piece of paper. Nietzsche's editors decided to include it in their edition, and so it figures now as fragment classified number 12,175 in the French translation of The Gay Science on page 457. Nobody knows what it means. Is it a reference, a mnemonic aid? Had he really forgotten his umbrella? We just don't know. And it's with this sentence that Derrida ends his text. Quote, maybe a citation, it might have been a sample picked up somewhere, overheard here or there. Perhaps it was the note for some phrase to be written here or there. But in fact, what Derrida proposes to us at the end of his text is that it is a bit the same thing as we read this passage or read other passages of Nietzsche. He writes, quote, to whatever lengths one might carry a conscientious interpretation, the hypothesis that the totality of Nietzsche's text in some monstrous way might well be of the type, I have forgotten my umbrella, cannot be denied. And so the problem of interpretation, of imposition, and of the infiniteness of interpretation is most keenly felt precisely there. I sense this same sensibility in Derrida. One has to find sentences that have meaning or make meaning of them. There's an intention, it seems, but in fact we are inserting interpretations as if we were in the process of interpreting a text that we will never grasp. How to read Derrida, then? That poses a real challenge. Sarah Kaufman, at the beginning of Nietzsche and Metaphor, asked herself the same question about Nietzsche. How does one write about Nietzsche's metaphors, without using metaphors? How does one write conceptually about Nietzsche's metaphors? How does one do this conceptual work? Kaufman wondered if it might not be necessary to write in the form of metaphors. We may have the same problem in our reading of Derrida. How could we try to impose a meaning on this text that has just told us that the text is perhaps nothing more than a forgotten umbrella? Yet there is a very clear thesis in the book, I'd argue, or at least suggest here. Derrida writes on page 56, 57 of the University of Chicago version, congruence, their congruence, I note, a notion which I oppose by convention to that of coherence, although is just as rigorously necessary, he writes. Such, in any case, will be the thesis of the present communication. The thesis of the present communication. So the congruence of what? The congruence of Nietzsche's different styles, of Nietzsche's different references to women. The thesis, perhaps, is that there is a congruence between the propositions that are in appearance more feminine-friendly, on the one hand, in Nietzsche, and on the other hand, all of Nietzsche's writings that are patently misogynist. Derrida's analysis of Nietzsche's writings then reveals, he says, three types of statements. This is on page 96, 97 of the text. The first, woman taken as a figure of potentate of falsehood finds herself censored, debased, and despised, unquote. The second, quote, the woman is censored, debased, and despised. Only in this case it is as the figure or potentate of truth. The third, quote, beyond the double negation of the first two, woman is recognized and affirmed as an affirmative power. 97. We could say, or at least suggest, he suggests right there, Derrida, that these three statements correspond to the castrated woman, the castrating woman, and the affirmatory woman, he writes. These are the three different statements, and Derrida uses this to show Nietzsche's different styles, to represent these different styles. And from there one might suggest, although I'm not entirely sure that I want to attribute this to Derrida, but what I would say, what I could do with his intervention, is demonstrate that one finds these different styles in Nietzsche's work, and that in the end what one does by choosing an interpretation from all these styles, by choosing a reading of Nietzsche over another, and we have so many here, that choice is to say something not so much about Nietzsche, but about our own projects, our own desires, our own politics, our own objects. And it is in this sense that I feel Derrida's text to be so deeply Nietzschean. It resonates so profoundly and not exegetically with Nietzsche's sensibility, with his idea, for instance, in The Genealogy of Morals, that all meaning and interpretation is just evidence that a will to power has exercised itself over another. This would be, as I'm sure you are familiar, a deconstruction that deauthorizes Nietzsche's text and in the end turns things back towards us as interpreters. One should not seek truth in Nietzsche. One does not go looking for answers in Nietzsche. One does not go looking for a model in Nietzsche. Instead, perhaps we end up, through this textual analysis, through this textual method, being returned to ourselves in each of our readings. And what is so interesting about this essay is that it is precisely a specimen of a perhaps Nietzschean maneuver, which does not consist in an effort to find a lost truth in Nietzsche's work itself, but to live it out. But of course, I may just be misinterpreting forgotten umbrellas. Perhaps Derrida himself didn't quite know what he meant by all that. He seems to say exactly as much at the end on page 135. Fortunately, though, we are joined tonight to help us to read Derrida's text and make sense of it by two extraordinary scholars, Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak and Bruno Bostiels, two leading authorities on Derrida and contemporary critical thought. We're absolutely delighted to welcome back to the 1313 series our own university professor, Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak. You will recall, I'm sure, her remarkable intervention last year, as you will remember, at the closing of Foucault 1313 on the courage of truth, alongside Frédéric Gros. It was at about that time, I think, that Jesus and I started imagining Nietzsche 1313, as it is about now that we are starting to imagine revolution. Professor Spivak just published a few months ago the 2016 40th anniversary edition of Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology, and so we're thrilled to ask her, or to be with her, to revisit Derrida's Nietzsche tonight. Professor Spivak is the author most recently of Readings, in 2014 also, which sets forth a vision of the kind of deep and investigative reading that can develop a will for peaceful social justice in coming generations, and as well an aesthetic education in the age of globalization, 2012, as well as a number of other seminal books that we all have learned from and admire. Professor Spivak is a founding director and member of the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society here at Columbia, and as well an activist in rural education and feminist and ecological movements. Bruno Bostil joins us at Columbia University as professor in the Latin American and Iberian Cultures Department and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. And we're delighted to have him at Columbia and to have with us tonight. Having taught previously at Cornell and Harvard Universities, he's the author of Alain Badiou, Une trajectoire polémique, Badiou and Politics, The Actuality of Communism, and Marx and Freud in Latin America, which is out now with Verso, I believe. Yes? Yes. Good. He's also preparing, after Borges, or is that out also? No, preparing. Okay, Literature and Anti-Philosophy. He's translated Alain Badiou's Theory of the Subject, as well as Badiou's Can Politics Be Thought? And What is Anti-Philosophy? Essays on Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Lacan, as well as Wittgenstein's Anti-Philosophy. And he's the author of dozens of articles and other essays on modern Latin American literature and culture and on contemporary European philosophy and political theory. And he also served as the general editor of Diacritics. Now, we were also hoping to be joined this evening as well by philosopher Danielle Cohen-Levinas, a professor at the University Paris-Sorbonne Paris 4. But sadly, because of personal reasons, she was unable to join us in New York this week. We first and most importantly send her all our thoughts and support. And secondly, look forward to welcoming her next academic year in the context of our continuing 1313 series. We have posted her essay online, and so I encourage you to read it. It's a marvelous essay. After Gayatri and Bruno have spoken, Jesus Velasco, my comrade in arms, our philologist and legal historian, our critical theorist, our medievalist as well, will comment and open the discussion. So let me pass the mic to Gayatri Spivak.
Okay, wait a second, let's find something. Yes, that's a good place. That's a very fine place. The mic's picking me up. Everybody can hear me in the back and so on. I wish I was speaking about revolution, but who knows, I may be dead by then. Next year. Okay, I'm going to be a little more conventional about Nietzsche than I have been in the past. I put online, did you actually put it on? An essay which I wrote when I was 37 years old in 1979, and called Displacement and the Discourse of Woman, where I discussed this piece and some other pieces and tried to show that although Derrida was certainly very admirable in that he was looking at the question of woman, saying that it would have been my title would have been, and I think Barbara Harlow, who recently died, and a wonderful activist writer who translated this, I think her heart was not in this translation. I knew Barbara very well after translation. She was Eugenio Donato's student, and Donato put her to translating this, and she did what she could, but she was a completely different kind of soul. And so after this, she just put everything behind her, and I think it shows. And I would complain to her, saying, Barbara, I wish you hadn't done it, because she's certainly was capable of doing a meticulous translation, but this is not, in fact, unfortunately, a good translation. So she misses that part of will have been, aurait été, but she just does her thing. She does just would have been or whatever. And it's in that space that Derrida says, but my subject will be woman, and I comment on that. And so I go on to say that however interesting this move is. However, we must see that the woman, in a certain sense, gives distance, as Nietzsche says, and it's also a word that contains for Nietzsche the word tanz and dancing and so on and so forth. Impeccably done. Nonetheless, there is always a problem with being a sort of complicit, straight female. And I see what unlike many people I know, I don't go back to my old stuff. I'm not a great fan of my stuff, unfortunately. But I did go back because I asked people to read it. And I think this thing is useful today because it implies an LGBTQ type subject here. You know, I mean, I had written just before this that piece called French Feminism in an International Frame, and I bring that into here. But at any rate, this therefore diagnoses Derrida a bit about how it is not really possible, given the positions in which we are, it's not possible to actually follow this track. It's interesting to admire it, but that's about what we can do. Now, many years have passed. Today, I want to talk about something which is, I mean, I certainly will go back to the question of woman. I mean, it's always on my mind, as it should be on everyone's, but I want to talk about something slightly different. One small comment about women before I move on there. What happens in this text, as everybody knows, is that it's not, when one talks about women in one way or another in the Nietzsche text and Derrida on Nietzsche text, what comes through is the woman who cannot be defined into this womanness, and that's the post-reproductive woman, who's very scary because she does not need the phallus, and so she knows what goes on. And so therefore, and of course the big name for that, in fact, post-reproductive female genitals is Baubo. And so Nietzsche gets that from Clement of Alexandria, as I said in my little blog, and Heidegger notices what in fact Clement is doing, which is saying that Christians, that there is in fact within Greek philosophy, religion, you know, the philosophical side, Christianity is already assumed, and therefore what Kant would call the Nebengeschäfte, the secondary tasks, things that people do within religion, can be ignored. And the worship of Baubo, the worship of the post-reproductive female genitals, is dismissed in that way. And Heidegger says also dismissively that, oh yes, of course, Clement is correct. But what Nietzsche does is he turns it around and in fact puts Baubo in there again as this other kind of figure. And that's a very interesting gesture, and that too I'm not going to spend time with. What I suggested in the blog, I would ask you again, I would exhort you to read Christine Brooke-Rose. Christine Brooke-Rose's fantastic work, in fact, does in a literary way, in a kind of rhetorical staging, she does pick up the problem that I merely kind of noticed in that very old essay. And I suggested a book, a particular novel, which is about an old woman dying. It's called Life, End of, an index entry, as it were. And that's a novel that I think people should read in order to really get the fact that you cannot talk about this becoming woman, question of woman, fear of Baubo, and so on and so on. Very excellent, okay. They're not doing straightforward idea of knowledge is knowledge about knowledge, kind of phallocentric type critique. Excellent. But at the same time, you cannot just do this forgetting that if you are going to say, as Derrida was saying, at that point, as I said in my email to you folks, that one of the problems with Heidegger was that he did not realize that this kind of sexuation, as it were, comes before procreation and so on and so forth. All of this is utterly admirable. But on the other hand, if one is going to take this as I hadn't yet thought through the fact that this difference is what actually allows, at a very crude level, the formation of the socius. And so culture can be explained by looking at gender as the first primary tool of abstraction presented as the concrete as such, which has really rather little to do with this. But you can see that it is, to an extent, that continuity that we are obliged to disrupt. That's where all of that was. But, you know, one is not able to do everything that one thinks should be done. I mean, one has to realize that these people are extremely smart. And so, to an extent, I would give you, I'm a literature teacher, I will give you another example of a text where this predicament is staged, which is Joyce's The Dead. Gabriel Conroy, looking at the snow, is the way in which one, you know, being able to imagine the critical gestures necessary, and in our case, the profoundly feminist critical gestures, and yet not being able to actually perform those gestures. That's where one gets stuck. And so there are these two literary texts that I would ask you to read. Now, where I want to go, this forgetting of the umbrella and so on, it's very interesting. I want to turn to Derrida's few words on Nietzsche in De la Grammatologie, where he suggests that I was much taken by Taylor Carman's reading of Heidegger on Nietzsche, that Heidegger changes profoundly about Nietzsche right in the middle, 1939. So in fact, what Derrida says, on the other hand, is that Heidegger's way of reading Nietzsche, that before and after, he does talk about Introduction to Metaphysics in the Grammatology, it's fine and it's possible. And if you read Nietzsche straight, it's possible. But on the other hand, if you look at Nietzsche writing as writing, in other words, saying that he is not, in fact, committed to the Logos as giving him the subject about which he writes, then it's perhaps possible to see in Nietzsche something else. Even so, Derrida is not convinced that Nietzsche goes the whole way. Two things. One, saying I'm sorry, I forgot to bring the English translation, and this is really not something I should do. I translated the book, but here is page 206 of the French, where he makes a distinction between the difference in Nietzsche, in son mouvement actif, in its active movement, the difference that he's just talking about, that is to say, difference from a source that gives him a whole idea of reference. This difference is nonetheless, it is compris sans l'épuiser dans le concept de différence with an A. It is contained, it's comprehended, contained, without exhausting it within the idea of différence with an A. There is a difference between Nietzsche and me, says he. And then I'll go to this, and the thing that I really want to read. Alas, I'm using up my time. But at any rate, so what is the difference? And for this, one has to go to the end of Wahrheit und Lüge, the truth and falsity in an extramoral sense, where the artist, face covered, gets out of the fray. This staging of the importance of metaphor is what Derrida questions. Derrida's idea is that metaphor is as much nestled in logic as logic is held up by metaphor. So that's the white mythology. It's that piece. And that's the difference between Nietzsche's making primary of metaphor and Derrida's not giving up anywhere, but seeing that it's the concept metaphor, metaphor concept, logic in rhetoric, rhetoric in logic, that endlessly takes us here and there. Now, at this point, therefore, the difference where you can move into metaphor and say, look, man, no hands, no logos here, is what is not something that Derrida can do. So Derrida is obliged to say logocentrism is not a pathology. And so that particular, in that sort of a situation, where Derrida is looking at the fact, what différence is, after all, very simple. It is dependent upon challenging the simplest kind of simplest kind of logic and saying, look here, be responsible to what you suggest. If A is A, then all of the not A's are implied within that remark, and it brings up all the not A's that have not been brought in. That's différence. So that you cannot declare a simple origin. It's very, very commonsensical, and that's the thing with Derrida. And that is rather different from stopping with metaphor and the artist kind of. So that particular situation is where Derrida differentiates himself, and he says the Heideggerian reading is possible, but read Nietzsche in this other way. And he tries to read Nietzsche in that other way in Spurs, where, how does one do it? Again, it's very commonsensical. Is there anybody from my senior seminar in this room? I thought at least Armand Latreille would come in. But because we've been actually pushing this point with a novel of Toni Morrison's about epigraphs. You know, and I've been trying to tell these young people who are really very, very smart, but they don't yet know how to read, that, you know, you have to be extremely attentive to epigraphs, because they point the text outside, away from the covers, right? So to an extent, what Derrida does in order to read Nietzsche within a kind of différence is that. So it's not that he wants particularly to be funny about the umbrella and so on. It is that he doesn't want this text to begin with the thetic. You know, he's certainly capable of writing that way, and in fact, De la Grammatologie writes about Nietzsche and Heidegger precisely that way. But what he wants to do is go into a letter within which that's how it begins. He says, I will make this a certain kind of exurg, something outside of the work, right? Exurg. So this already he's pointing. This is kind of, and I'm going to use up my time and not read what I really want to read. But this is where he is talking about, that's why it's called éperon. Because it's éperon, that's, immediately he goes into English, that is called spurs. Okay? Everything that cuts through the two kinds of veil. In the feminine, it's the, the sail. And in the masculine, it's the voile, it's the veil, right? And the style cuts through. We can see that that's kind of very simple. But in English, it's called spurs. And in German, the word is Spur. And Spur, of course, is Spur, you know, our favorite metaphor for trace, elephant shit on the forest floor. So the difference between, you know, because what does elephant shit on the forest floor tell you? Spur, spur. It tells you that there were perhaps elephants here, right? That's what it tells you. So it's like a trace. That's spur, trace. That isn't like a sign system, which, you know, which provides you a guarantee that in a certain systematicity, you're going to get to a meaning. Trace simply says, there be meaning, okay? That's it. But it is possible that that's really not elephant shit. You don't know what it looks like. Or it's possible that someone put a decoy there to make you think that there were bloody elephants there. See, so the trace is much more, you know, it's the fortgesetzte Zeichenkette that you cut off, as in Nietzsche. So the trace is much more mysterious. And so spurs is not just spurs. On a false etymology, Derrida is moving into the trace and says, hey, let's not do style, etc., which cuts through like that. Actually, it's the woman at a distance. It's the trace, because that's all women can do, you know what I mean? Not promise a signed system, say, there be language. Okay, so that's the trace thing, right? And so that's how he begins. He begins by invoking a trace thing and invoking a letter to a woman who was a very special kind of woman, Magdeburg, and a letter to a woman, and in it there is something that's the trace thing. He writes, have you received the bundle I sent you? And there is the moment which he says, now what was in that bundle? You see, that's the thing about epigraphs, except here it's being done rhetorically, stylistically, in a very inviting people to learn how to read. That, look, that's what happens at the beginning of reading, where you decide this printed object is a simple origin. Look at this. And so therefore, Derrida will make a sort of excerpt out of this. See, at this stage, he can afford to be weird. You know what I mean? I mean, grammatology is out. He's Différence, very straightforward essay, where a young 36-year-old philosopher is speaking to the Philosophical Society and saying, look, man, there is a method here. Those are very straightforward. And now at this point, he's letting it go a little bit, 72. And it's also interesting that the letter to Magdeburg was written in 1872. He never mentions that, but there you are. But at any rate, now I want to go away from this now. I've given you a sense of this. And invoke another letter to the same woman, which was written a little bit later, which is in a piece published in 1983. I have the French, but it's, and I mentioned it, which is The Ear of the Other. The Ear of the Other. Okay? Now, the thing is that even in Spurs, Derrida talks about the fact that Nietzsche is in the labyrinth of the ear. The labyrinth structure is very interesting. This is called l'oreille de l'autre, the ear of the other, autobiographie, O-T-O, ear, not A-U-T-O, transfert, traduction, etc. Derrida talking about Nietzsche and his labyrinth. Now, what is he talking about? He's talking, in 1983 also, there was a very important meeting, which, if I had more time, we would talk about, on Heidegger and Nazism. And in France, it's just been published by Mireille Calgubert, and it has now been translated into English. But there, these questions, and this is 1983 also, he is talking about a letter that Nietzsche writes on December 20, 1872. Now, this method of working is also suggested in grammatology. In grammatology, when he has at last discovered in Rousseau the possibility of a positive, affirmative, as he says in Spurs, deconstructive reading, it's because of the word supplément. And in the same way, in Nietzsche, when he finds the possibility of noticing just difference and moving it into différence, he is going on these epistolary structures. There are many more letters in here in Spurs also. Nietzsche writing to someone else. So, so the letter quoted in Spurs is 7th November 1872. This one is December 20. And what Derrida is talking about is that Nietzsche absolutely refused to, he swore that a certain set of essays that he wrote on the lectures that he gave on the university should not be published. he writes, he says, "By now you will have read these lectures and have been startled by the story's abrupt ending after such a long prelude," and so on and so forth. "These lectures are summary and what is more, a bit improvised, but I swore not to publish any book that doesn't leave me with a conscience as clean as an angel's." And so, and he writes it also in a very theatrical way. These lectures are about schools, and they're really, one needs to put the 1983 Derrida talking about Heidegger together with and since this is the only time that I will be speaking to you, I'm just kind of taking the liberty of pushing you toward that text. So there he's talking about, he's doing something different. And I will say that today, in the situation of he's talking about Nietzsche and fascism, and he's talking about, and this is a very important passage, and even if Nazism, he writes, page 29, far from being the regeneration called for by these lectures of 1872, lectures on destroying gymnasiums and universities, these lectures of 1872 were only a symptom of the accelerated decomposition of European culture and society as diagnosed. It still remains to be explained how reactive, this is very, very important, how reactive degeneration could exploit the same language, the same words, the same utterances, the same rallying cries as the active forces to which it stands opposed. Of course, neither this phenomenon nor this specular ruse eluded Nietzsche. Those of us who are a little troubled by all the talk about leadership training that we hear as the country goes fascist should remember this, because that's what Nietzsche says, that our students need Führer, so bedürfen die zu Führenden der Führer. Our students need leaders, just as great leaders need followers. So those who are led need the leaders, a certain reciprocal predisposition. Now, if the largest sector of the electorate is not properly educated, you will in fact have leadership problems. We know it in my country and we know it here. And in the same way, on the other hand, all this leadership training, same words doing good in the poor sections, and all these conferences about female leadership and so on and so forth, to which I'm regularly invited, and I go and I give precisely this talk, but in a more organized way. So how is it possible that the same kind of language is used for reactive degeneration and that which it is clearly opposing? And that's where something that is very important in Derrida comes in, and that's what, in fact, Nietzsche, in his own way, never fully suggested, but it's everywhere in his text. What is medicine is also poison. So in other words, and so therefore, the activist, remember Benjamin's critique of violence. Derrida, in that long footnote in Force of Law, says that if followed through, it would lead to the same thing as Hitler's final solution. Very courageous thing for a Jew to write at that point. But nonetheless, very courageous at the same time, recognizing, and he wrote similarly about Levinas and so on. So that particular idea, activist reading, that's what you teach. That is to say, how to use, because you are complicit. It is only if you know how to use it that the poison can be administered as medicine. And this never stops. Every generation must learn this. It's a different theory of reading. It is exactly what is not knowledge management, templates and toolkits and so on. And so that's why the umbrella. The forgetfulness of the umbrella does not come as a big transcendental signifier, as in Lacan, Derrida would say. The umbrella comes even in exactly the same way, that trace way, that non-referential way, that a code that no one can break. What was that bundle way? But nonetheless, it's there. So when the guy says, j'ai oublié ma parapluie, how are we going to understand this? Not as a declarative. It's the real problem of declaratives that we're looking at here also. And this is what I was trying to teach, in fact, yesterday in Toni Morrison, that the literary shakes up the declarative. And you know that that's what he's doing here. It's put in the rhetorical so that, as in the case of Gramsci, so in the case of Nietzsche, he's going on to say all through, do take a look at it, how to read Nietzsche. Already it is there in the, it's not because he's Nietzschean, as I will say this, he finds in Rousseau and in Nietzsche and characters like this, the track, the trace of a way toward affirmative deconstruction, which he will later take as a phrase, which he, as in a friendly embrace, it's the deconstructive embrace, as it were, critical intimacy rather than critical distance, he is going to be able to pull through. That's what he's doing. He is not, I think I should close now, but what he's doing here in this text is again and again showing that so much of what Nietzsche wrote, Heidegger is correct, he says, in suggesting that if you look at the eternal return in a certain way, you will see that even in the name of breaking up everything, what Nietzsche can do, and I'm kind of, I'm not quoting, but this is more or less in Heidegger, right? That what he's doing is he is actually presenting again the infinite repetition of the same. That's what Heidegger says. In fact, I was very pleased to see that Taylor, in fact, actually cited that passage. And Heidegger says, yes, of course you can say that. But in order to be able to get around it, learn how to read the text when it offers you certain kinds of words, and which is why Barbara's translation of what you read, notion of contagion, that ain't the word in the French. If you turn to the French, you'll say it's le mot. It's not the notion. He doesn't like the word, whatever it is, contingent. We could actually look at it if you wished. What page was it? You read from it?
Was it 97?
No, it's the one before that. 50 something. See, if you look at it, you'll see. Oui, congruence, yes. Well, what page?
Page 56.
56, there we go. And you will look, you will see that on this side, it says la congruence, mot que j'opposerai ici, pas convention, à cohérence. And Barbara says, congruence, a notion which I oppose by convention. No, it's not a notion at all. It's a word. And there is a difference when a philosopher uses the word word. You know what I mean? It's a very poetic kind of thing, forlorn. That very word is like a bell that rings me back from thee to my soul self. Already. That's what we are looking at here, words. And so he says here that if you look at Nietzsche writing here saying, no, this text will be posthumous, which is will to power, right? But then these texts I will never publish. Just as Gramsci never wrote a book. Those were notes. So you can't say this is what Gramsci thinks about hegemony. So the thing is, in the same way, Derrida is looking at Nietzsche in ways that Heidegger is not. Because Heidegger decides that this is a body of thought. And so in the end, it's Plato on whom it hangs for Heidegger and Nietzsche, right? They are all going back to Plato. Derrida thinks the same. But what kind of structure does he give us? The structure that he gives us at the end is that we should, since we can't get away from Plato, we should echo him. And the word echo, echoing Plato, comes from the phenomenology. And both Hegel and Derrida knew their of it. So when they say we should echo, that's a calling on woman, which is much more interesting than all of this stuff about Baobo, etc., etc. I wanted to put it in a kind of nutshell so that you would get the sense of what one can do with woman, and I cited 2 literary texts. But then I wanted to move away to 1983, when in a conversation in between those 2 letters to Marc Debout, he puts another Nietzsche who says, I will never publish any of these texts that I have any of these lectures that I have given on the school and on teaching and so on and so forth. And those are the ones where Nietzsche is accused of being resonant with Nazism, and Derrida says, so he is. But we have to look, and how is it that the same language can be used? But we have to look at the fact of the protocol of the text, because its author makes these statements. And so therefore I end with the method that he's working with at this point, and all through, which he discovers, and he writes about this at great length in the Grammatology, after having read Rousseau so painstakingly, that our method is empiricism with no guarantees. Truly with no guarantees. That's where all of that, what was the bundle? So empiricism, which acknowledges that empirical research is much more like following traces than, that's why in the Grammatology he cites from the 18th century on down all of the wonderful empirical research about what was the essay on the origin of languages, to show that in the end they can't decide. See, so therefore, that's what we are looking at here, and it's not just Spurs, which is 1972 and early, but as he moves through, he comes to a Nietzsche who is not yet who has not yet graduated into différance, but is caught with indifference. And there are certain kinds of texts in him that we must read very carefully in terms of empirically, historical diagnoses that can be made, but we must take from it a lesson for reading. In this, woman and trace, but in this, the ear of the other, complicity, and teaching the use of, I don't say pharmacon because his idea of pharmacon is much more complicated than just medicine and poison, but teaching and reading in such a way that one can, in fact, acknowledge complicity and use poison as, teach the use of poison as medicine, so that you don't just clean up your act, because it is never cleaned up. So I think I have actually spoken more than 15-20 minutes, and in this inconclusive way, I pass it on to Bruno, who will be much more organized. This guy is a nicely organized scholar, and I'm looking forward to his paper. Thank you very much.
As you'll see, as you'll see, I've lately been reading and rereading much more Gayatri Spivak than Derrida. And in a sense, I think we're in many aspects on the same page. Gayatri and I, in terms of how we approach these texts, despite the, some of the expectations of a polemic here. And I want to, in a sense, what Gayatri, the passage from of Grammatology that she didn't read, in which she was going to read, in which Derrida says that Nietzsche exceeds the Heidegger interpretation by pointing already at the question whether the thinking of being should precede différance, or whether the thinking of being should rather be rethought from différance, and that's already suggested in Nietzsche, and therefore Nietzsche cannot be caught within the Heideggerian reading as the last metaphysician. This, in a sense, is also for me the starting point. But I want to try to pry open a few problems in that very definition of Nietzsche as a thinker who is on the path to différance. Gayatri just used a wonderful expression, although it may be a little bit theological, in which Nietzsche had not yet graduated into différance, but was stuck in difference, right? As though you graduate from difference and get a diploma, of différance. So, this is called like what is or who is Derrida's Nietzsche. Rather than playing coy, I should probably start out by admitting that I have never been a real fan of Derrida. Even though I have had an uninterrupted habit of reading his work that goes back to my time as an undergraduate in Belgium, and like Heidegger for Derrida, Derrida for me constitutes something like a watchman. Derrida says, this is in an interview with Janicot and the mega project about Heidegger in France. For me, he, Heidegger, is something like a watchman, a thinking that always keeps watch over me, an overseeing who is always watching over me, a thinking that I feel has me under surveillance. For me, it is an inexhaustible relationship which is made of, again, movements of positive admiration, of recognition, of debt, and then sometimes quite severely of critical impatience and always very ironic. So just add a few more, or a more generous dose of ironic impatience, and I think nothing describes better than this comment, my own attitude toward Derrida and deconstruction. Then again, I never personally met Derrida. My encounters with him, there have been 2 or 3, have always been as a simple member in the audience, but in one way or another, these encounters were always mediated by Gayatri. I remember running into her sometime, must have been 1993 or 1994, at the end of Derrida's talk at NYU, that would become part of the tableau of the 10 plagues of our time that are a follow-up to the Spectres of Marx project. And I saw Derrida again 5 or 6 years later here at Columbia, right after the 9/11 attacks, where Gayatri introduced him before a packed audience in SIPA that quickly transformed what was supposed to be a book presentation of the work of mourning into a collective therapy session. I mean, people in the end were holding hands. But then Professor Spivak never allowed me to sit in on her Derrida seminar that I wanted to audit as a graduate student. For someone who was really an academic, much more so than not a really academic, but an activist, she told me, she simply could not accept auditors in her class. I mentioned this without the slightest note of regret or resentment, Nietzsche and ressentiment, but only as a way of giving you a context for the sense of trepidation with which I address you in the company of someone who now is a great friend, but who's also a towering authority on the subject of Derrida. So allow me then to take cover and situate my comments today under the heading of 3 epigraphs, the first one of which is from Derrida's Éperon, Le Style de Nietzsche, for which I have significantly altered the translation into English. If the simulacrum is ever going to occur, one must write in the gap between several styles. If there is style, what the woman of Nietzsche, or the woman Nietzsche, insinuates is that there must be more than one. Right? In fact, I could have chosen a much worse passage on page 38, 39, which is il n'y a pas d'essence de la femme parce que la femme écarte et s'écarte d'elle-même. There is no essence of woman, and here Barbara Harlow translates, I think prudishly, as averts. But it says la femme écarte et s'écarte elle-même, which is a pretty vulgar, misogynist pun that is actually avoided by saying that woman averts and averts herself. This is on page, I'm using the French edition here, so it's the end of Voile. I'm talking about this identification of woman with the écart, with the gap of a plural style. The second epigraph, which is in a sense used to counter Derrida's reading, is from the Italian feminist Carla Lonzi, who in 1970 wrote a truly spectacular manifesto for the collective Rivolta Femminile under the title Sputiamo su Hegel, Let's Spit on Hegel. And she writes, we must insist on our being in full possession of ourselves, since every time a gap opens, there is always somebody ready to occupy the space and appropriate us to himself. Finally, the third epigraph is from Catherine Malabou, who is not only an ex-student and longtime collaborator of Derrida's, but also the author of formidable books of her own, most notably on Hegel and Heidegger. In her book, Changing Difference, Changer de Différence, a beautiful, multiple title. The Feminine and the Question of Difference, Malabou wonders out loud both to herself and to her readers. Has anyone ever invented anything whatsoever in deconstruction after Derrida? Has anyone done anything other than mummify, worship, turn to stone the figure of the master? Has anyone ever escaped the involuntary pastiche which Proust describes as being condemned to live forever attached to the tongue of a bell? Of course, we can say, as Spivak, says, yes, people have done something new after. I know.
I want to talk about people. I'm not in the Derrida entourage, and they don't read me.
I know.
I'm bad. I'm not good.
But I want to ask. I want to ask the question how somebody like Malabou would have come to this point of feeling that this is not possible, right? Herself being a great student of Derrida. These three epigraphs, I think, should already give you an idea of what lurks behind the question that I would want to raise with you today. Who is Derrida's Nietzsche? Now, the question who, as we know from Deleuze's Nietzsche and Philosophy, first published in 1962, may have been of recent invention. It may even be Nietzsche's greatest invention. That is, for philosophy to ask the question not what is, but who is. For example, as Heidegger also asks toward the end of his decades-long Nietzsche interpretation, which goes back to his lecture courses from the 1930s, but was not published in book form until 1961. Who is Nietzsche Zarathustra? With Nietzsche, the question becomes not what is man, as in Kant's fourth question, which is the quintessential question of anthropology, that would underlie the questions that respectively define the project of the three critiques, namely, what can I know, what must I do, what am I allowed to hope for? But who is man, not what is man? Which is a question to which Nietzsche's signature answer, as Derrida reminds us in Autobiographie, L'enseignement de Nietzsche et la politique du nom propre, which was first presented actually in 1976. This is already a very early text. Is simultaneous with the quadrilingual publication of Spurs, right? Which came out also in 1976. Nietzsche's answers to this question is essentially equivocal. I am so and so, ich bin der und der. My name is Legion. Who practices philosophy? Who loves or is in love with wisdom, with knowledge, with truth? To answer these questions requires a typology. Who? What type of man? As well as a genealogy. How does one become who one is? Derrida's intervention, and perhaps his greatest invention, at least with regard to Nietzsche, but one that is not without problems of its own, is to have introduced the question of woman into this framework, for asking the question that becomes the philosopher's question with Nietzsche. Who? Who then is Derrida's Nietzsche? In Spurs, Derrida begins by remarking upon the extent to which to ask the question of style, since always may have been the work of men, and of straight men at that. To introduce one's pointed stylus into the matter or matrix of being, to leave behind a mark of one's own type, imprint, or character for posterity, albeit posthumously and with 2,000 years of delay so as not to be misunderstood, is this not what all great men dream of accomplishing? The male fantasy of progeny, at once pro-genus and pro-genius. What would happen then if the question of style were to become the question of woman? That is the question that Derrida asks of the woman Nietzsche, or of the woman of Nietzsche. Who is Derrida's Nietzsche? In the plural styles of Nietzsche, this is the question that I would like to address with you today. Suppose that Derrida's Nietzsche is a woman, what then? Now, before we jump on the bandwagon of countless feminist critiques of Derrida's reading, most of which, in fact, if it comes down to it, in books like Derrida and Feminism, repeat Gayatri's essay on the displacement of women without quoting her, we should remember the astonishing novelty that this reading introduced in the landscape of Nietzsche studies up to that point in France. I mean, it is certainly astonishing for us, US critics, students, and teachers today, we who have been trained in multiculturalism and the critique of identity politics. But it was even more astonishing and unheard of at the time though for completely different reasons, when Derrida first presented La question du style at the 1972 conference in Cerisy-la-Salle in Normandy, in the same cultural center where less than a decade later the first international conference on Derrida's work would take place, La fin de l'homme, or The Ends of Man, a conference which included Gayatri among other US critics, many of them women, with a fired-up presentation titled Il faut s'y prendre en s'en prenant à elle. Literally, one must tackle the issue by taking it up with them, which is actually a quotation from Derrida's Où commence et comment finit un corps enseignant, which was first published in 1976 and then reprinted in Du droit à la philosophie, From the Right to Philosophy. And in Derrida's text, the plural feminine pronoun elle, or them, originally refers to loi, or laws. But in Gayatri's creative use, it can be understood as referring generically to women, of course, with all the potentially misogynist and problematic connotations and displacements the term prendre also has in the Nietzsche fragments discussed in Spurs. Now, why do I say that Derrida's intervention in Spurs was so astoundingly new for its time? What was, after all, the situation on the philosophical front in France, particularly with regard to Nietzsche? What was the scene of the French Nietzsche like before the 1972 conference in Cerisy-la-Salle called Nietzsche aujourd'hui, or Nietzsche today, many contributions to which have been translated into English as part of the volume The New Nietzsche, where Derrida was joined not only by the likes of Deleuze or Lyotard, but also by his own students, Jean-Michel Rey, Bernard Poitras, and Sarah Kaufmann, all authors of individual monographs on Nietzsche's philosophy and rhetoric, as well as by Jean-Luc Nancy and Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, two young thinkers who were never quite Derrida's students in any formal capacity, but all the more so his philosophical accomplices and later the organizers of the very conference La Fin de l'Homme. Until 1972, it is no exaggeration to say, Nietzsche in France was exclusively a man's affair. In 1961, Heidegger had published his two-volume Nietzsche, but this text would not be translated into French by Pierre Klossowski until a full decade later in 1971. And even in Éperon, Derrida still complains that the reading of Heidegger's Nietzsche continues to be sabotaged in France. In 1962, Deleuze published his Nietzsche and philosophy, but to my knowledge, Derrida never refers to this reading in his own interpretations of Nietzsche. In fact, and John may correct me here, other than the eulogy for Deleuze included in the work of mourning, I cannot recall a single instance where Derrida would quote Deleuze in any significant fashion. So much for friendship and the acknowledgement of complicity. But then, in 1964, a major conference on Nietzsche takes place in Royaumont, the proceedings of which will be published in 1967, the same miracle year in which Derrida, of course, publishes three of his major books, Speech and Phenomena of Grammatology and Writing and Difference, in which Nietzsche is repeatedly called upon, in these three texts, over and beyond Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche as the last metaphysician, as a source for the differentiation of two interpretations of interpretation, one based on the self-presence of origin and the other upon the play of difference or différence, between which Derrida nonetheless insists, and this is often forgotten when texts like Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences are anthologized over and over again in undergraduate textbooks. We should not think that the point is simply to choose. Thus, by the mid to late 1960s, the major theme of the French Nietzsche seems to be in place. Nietzsche is read as a philosopher of difference, more so than Dionysus against Christ or Ariadne against Socrates. The watchword or mot d'ordre of French philosophy becomes difference against the dialectic, Nietzsche against Hegel. We might add le mot against the notion, disgust with Hegel, ekel with Hegel. Have I been understood? And yet in Royaumont, where Deleuze is allowed to offer the concluding remarks and where attendants are able to listen to a veritable who's list of contemporary continental philosophy, there is no room for sexual difference. The speakers and the discussants, with the exception of one Mademoiselle Ramnou, who asks a question after Michel Foucault's presentation on Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, are all men. Young or old, established authorities or up-and-coming provocateurs, but all of them men, straight or not. Just imagine 20, 30, 40 men meeting among men over the course of 5 days between July 4th and 8th, 1964, but not one or only one woman. We thus begin to understand something of the explosive effect that Derrida's reading of Nietzsche must have provoked on the philosophical scene in France. Sure, with Jane Gallup, we could say that this reading now has become dated. I quote from her a text from the Reading Spurs in 90s Feminism. Spurs today, she asks. Derrida's timely intervention called into question a certain essentializing of woman in 70s feminism. No longer in that era, we can see that however much it questioned 70s woman, Spurs was not beyond what it questioned, but an engagement with it, sharing the assumption that in thinking about women, what we since have called gender was the only pertinent category, and that the only difference that was sexual was a distinction male-female. At the time when Derrida first presented what would later become Spurs as the question of style, though, we should not forget that here was someone who, perhaps like Nietzsche, was not a man but dynamite. Perhaps even dynamite because he was not a woman, but not a man but a woman. The woman Nietzsche, or the woman of Nietzsche. Now Derrida's reading and that of his students is also new for a different reason, which has to do with the register or genre in which he chooses to situate the debate with Nietzsche. In Nietzsche's plural style, we can and must distinguish between a great many genres, domains, or styles: philological, critical, genealogical, ontological, autobiographical, and so on. Nietzsche aura pratiqué tous les styles, Derrida writes, better translated literally as Nietzsche will have practiced all styles. Of all these styles, Derrida certainly touches upon many, but to the exclusion, I would say, of two: the genealogical and the ontological, or the doctrinal. Derrida does not systematically address the body of work that makes up the so-called middle period of Nietzsche's writing, in texts such as Human All Too Human or On the Genealogy of Morals. Nor does he attempt to draw a systematic doctrine, a lehre or enseignement, from Nietzsche's notions of the overman or the eternal return of the same. But these last topics, and the genres or styles of genealogy and ontology to which they respectively lend themselves, constitute precisely the main focus of two other interpreters whose work can be said to have been foundational in the reception of the French Nietzsche, namely Foucault and Heidegger. Derrida's Nietzsche, or the Derridian interpretation of Nietzsche, which can also be found in the work of his students, to whom he acknowledges his debt in the opening pages of Spurs, is concerned above all with questions of language, style, philology, rhetoric, metaphor, interpretation, and woman. But the question of woman, as the question of Nietzsche's many styles, does not appear in the work of Derrida's students until after the 1972 conference in Cerisy. Here I can also add a little personal note. I was going to add more biographical and personal notes, but I thought it would be a little bit corny. And since I think some of these are taped, I also didn't want my mom to get upset. But, you know, it had to do with the fact that my father, who died several years ago, was a Greek philologist, like Nietzsche, that he actually was sort of the epitome of the European last man, you know, filled with ressentiment, who felt that his Americanized son, who believed in the capacity to make something of your life, had been completely sold to, you know, the American way of life. So I have sort of a living rebuttal of my dad's last wishes. But I also remember as an undergraduate in Leuven, I would sit down on the floor in the library at the Catholic University of Leuven, flipping through a journal that many of you will not ever look at, which is called Poétique, a journal of poetics founded by Gérard Genette, who was Derrida's colleague in Le Mans, in which in one of the first issues we find obviously the publication of white mythology, La Mythologie Blanche, but we also find in 1971 a special issue in the same issue in which Lacoue-Labarthe publishes a text on Le Détour, you know, the detours of rhetoric, which is an engagement not only with texts on rhetoric and language by Nietzsche himself, which they translated and introduced together with Jean-Luc Nancy, but also the text Nietzsche et la métaphore, Nietzsche and Metaphor by Sarah Kaufmann, in which they, in a sense, are already beginning to counter Heidegger's reading, which, as Lacoue-Labarthe said, does not pay any attention at all to the rhetoric of writing. The same journal, Poétique, incidentally, also, I think in number 5 or 6, Gayatri can correct me, includes a text by young Gayatri Spivak on Allégorie et histoire de la poésie, hypothèse de travail, which is Gayatri's interpretation of Wordsworth's working hypothesis on allegory and history of poetry. So while part of this broader investigation into the language and rhetoric of philosophy, the question of the style or styles of the woman of Nietzsche is exclusively Derrida's invention. Woman will have been his subject, or the pointed object of his intervention, the trademark jotted down already by his stylo for all posterity to read. It is the yes or ja to that which is already déjà inscribed in the politics of his proper name, déjà or de Jacques. As 2 other feminist critics point out in response to this project, Derrida still wants to do it, but he wants to do it in style. These are jokes, you know, but they also hide the entire problematics of the re-essentializing that happens in Derrida's equation of style, of the écart, of the gap, of the multiplicity of styles with woman in Nietzsche. Now, what should we make of the style of this inscription? Aside from the fact that his discourse continues to displace the bodies of women, how should we evaluate Derrida's marking of his own proper name and autobiography on the body, the corps and the corpus, but also the corpse behind the huge corporation or société anonyme that is French Nietzscheanism? Perhaps not as big as the société anonyme that is Heideggerianism, which seems to thrive on every new scandal and every new black notebook that is being published in hardcover, very expensive hardcovers with Indiana University Press. Here, in talking about the corporation that is Nietzsche's corpse or corpse, I'm also thinking not just of a passage in Autobiographie where Derrida puns on Société Anonyme, but also the work of my good friend Jeff Wade, who has mercilessly dealt with this franchise in his book Nietzsche's Corps or Corpse with a slash. But nobody, I think, has offered a more forceful rebuke of the way Nietzsche in France became the trademark pedigree of the philosophy of difference than Catherine Malabou. Even Gayatri's 2 readings of Spurs, first in Displacement and the Discourse of Woman, and then in Feminism and Deconstruction, again, Negotiations, could fruitfully, I think, be contrasted or put side by side with this rebuke. And Malabou shares many of the same conclusions with Gayatri. According to Malabou, however, there is something profoundly amiss about the way post-Nietzschean and post-Heideggerian philosophies try to mobilize the principle of difference or différence, only to end up in the paradoxical immobility of an apparatus that in its anti-dialectical rage cannot stop rigidifying the difference as difference. Malabou's criticisms in this regard are fundamentally of 2 kinds. 1. Both Derrida and Deleuze, from a purely technical or philological point of view, would rely on the coup de force of a violent misreading, which turns Nietzsche and Heidegger into thinkers of difference as a selective principle, whether for evaluating who or what can pass the test of the eternal return, or for separating the metaphysical from the post-metaphysical in the leap into the other beginning beyond nihilism. And 2, the philosophies of difference that issue from this peculiar reading of Nietzsche and Heidegger, this time for strictly conceptual reasons, and regardless of whether this is actually a misreading, which would not be a big issue for me, would also be unable or unwilling to think of changing those very same structures of being which otherwise they see as marked and dislocated from within by the principle or gap of an internal difference. Now, so as not to get caught up in the typically masculinist cockfight over who got things right, I will not dwell on the first type of criticism. Suffice it to say that Malabou sees Derrida's or Deleuze's Nietzsche as a complete phantom construction. Difference, whether as Unterschied or Verschiedenheit, does not really appear as a word or as a notion in Nietzsche. She goes further. Isn't the difference itself, she asks, that is no more than a specter, and that as such is no longer operative, just like the critique of dialectics that it seeks to orient? After all, isn't there also a nihilist side to the thought of difference? Doesn't it also return as ressentiment, anti-Hegelian reaction, weakness? Doesn't it become its own phantom, an empty cask that has had its time? And if this first charge is not strong enough, the second kind of criticism is even more consequential. For it is here that we see a certain blockage become elevated into a rigid law of being, on whose altar the philosophers in question end up sacrificing the possibility of actually transforming those structures that they so adamantly seek to dismantle in the name of difference. In formulating this critique of the thought of difference, to be sure, Malabou does not follow the familiar path of showing the extent to which her immediate predecessors would have remained imprisoned, as if in spite of themselves, in the closure of idealist metaphysics. Her protocols for reading a philosophical text are themselves refreshingly plastic, rather than being reduced to either a deconstructive or a symptomatic approach in the styles of Derrida or Althusser. For her, especially as a woman philosopher, educated in the same elite tradition of the École Normale Supérieure, though still divided at the time between Ulm or Saint-Cloud for men and Sèvres or Fontenay for women, there is little to no room to breathe in such a confined understanding of deconstruction. She says, we have to admit that even the deconstruction of philosophy, which grants such an important place to gender difference and denounces the phallogocentrism of tradition, offers no other philosophical future to women than that of playing the replica. And even if we don't say it in terms of replica, we could add other terms like simulation, dissimulation, the veil, the veil, and so on, right? The voile. We should not haughtily dismiss statements like these in the way I have heard some of Malabou's older male colleagues do, as if they were merely the expression of an incomplete process of mourning, or worse, an Oedipal conflict that better be kept private, instead of being worked out in public for everyone to see and hear. Rather, I believe that Malabou's argument here speaks to the core of what she perceives to be an exalted blockage within the deconstructive tradition for thinking difference. Even if they fully by right correspond to an epochal moment of their own, the various philosophies of difference, more generally speaking, according to Malabou, have had their time, and at least in the way they are usually presented in the critical posterity of deconstruction, and I believe in particular in the US, no longer provide an apt motor scheme to think the present. In her view, the constant plasticity of processes of giving, shaping, receiving, and exploding form in the synaptic network of the brain as much as in the organic tissue of the body would no longer obey the older codes for the writing or graphing of the play of difference. The epochal configuration that Derrida in 1967 invokes so effectively at the beginning of grammatology in order to justify the enlarged sense of writing or archi-writing, archi-écriture, as a program that somehow was already in the air, also would account for the current decline of deconstruction. What goes up sooner or later also may have to come down. This was anticipated after less than a year by Derrida himself, when in his 1968 talk La Différence, he predicted that, and I quote, the efficacy of the thematic of difference may very well, indeed must, one day be superseded, lending itself not to its own replacement, at least to enmeshing itself in a chain that in truth it never will have governed. So it will, it will be extended. There will be other metaphors, in particular, starting with the work on Nietzsche, then in La Vérité de la Peinture, a question about the trait and the retrait, the retreat, which will be taken up by Nancy and Lacoue-Labarthe after the conference La Fin de l'Homme. For Malabou, the day has come for the supersession of the motor scheme of difference that was so presciently announced by her thesis advisor. Malabou in the end questions under what conditions and at what price philosophy after Nietzsche and Heidegger is able to affirm difference as difference. In spite of the presumed gap of the ontological difference, this presupposes, first of all, that somehow there must be ways to present the difference as difference. In order for metaphysics even to be recognizable as such, we must have access, or there must be a trace of the play or structure of difference as different from all metaphysical schemas. And a second presupposition behind the philosophies of difference, therefore, refers to the necessity of being able to instantiate the primordial difference as somehow given in singular experiences, whether it be in the simulacra of certain forms of art and literature, or in the radical upheavals, the ébranlement, marked by select political happenings of our time. That was the word that Derrida used about 68 in his paper, original paper on the ends of man, which was then taken up by Gayatri, by Jean-Luc Nancy, and by Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, among others, at the conference in the second conference in Cerisy. Now, despite the obvious appeal of many of these politico-artistic instantiations that thus will have been invoked, the price to pay for this hypostasis of difference is an inability actually to change those structures of meaning that would be breached from within by the principle of an insuperable gap, dislocation, or discrepancy. A principle that is always and everywhere, without exception, affirmed as the quasi-transcendental law of the simultaneous manifestation and dissimulation of being, for which woman in Nietzsche would have served as an always improper metaphoric name. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this extremely rich presentations. I, as always, feel humbled by them and hesitate a lot about presenting my own reflections in the end. And as a matter of fact, I'm not going to do it because I would rather keep the conversation alive rather than interfering with it. I just want to mention something that seems extremely important to me without the will to change, as I said, the direction of this conversation that I think our presenters, Gayatri Spivak and Bruno Bostels, have been somehow also mystically connected in many of their observations. But I just wanted to mention something that that struck me a little when I was reading and finding my way around the publication of Éperon and the consequences and the political consequences of the publication of Éperon, and in particular this deferred interview in writing kept between Christy MacDonald and Jacques Derrida, and how Christy MacDonald is pushing Derrida to actually explain what is his position towards feminism, towards the woman, but not in an essential or essentialist way that he doesn't seem to sometimes escape, even in Éperon, even when he critiques that sort of essentialization of the woman. And I see how, I kind of see how in this interview you see the reluctance, almost the reluctance, perhaps I'm not reading it well, but I see a certain anxiety, a certain reluctance, a certain labyrinthine sets of improvised responses, as he puts it, that avoid an engagement with this, with the politics of feminism. And that's one question I wanted to ask, and something I would like for our presenters to elaborate a little bit more, because I think they have announced it in their presentations, but have not elaborated very much on that, on questions that Gayatri Spivak formulated at first, like the problem of women, and then formulated even further in an extremely interesting way as how to read with this conversation Nietzsche, Derrida, and the other authors that she also put on top of the desk, how to read LGBTQ movements. So that's only one way I would like for them to explore. But as I said, I don't want to interfere with this conversation, and I would rather open it immediately to you, to your questions, to your commentaries, and of course to the commentaries of our presenters, to whom I thank very much for these fantastic presentations. So, some questions and some reactions. John, are you? I was. You were. I saw your hand.
Why is it turned on? That you've asked me. First, maybe to Bruno's question, did Derrida ever talk about Deleuze? It's very interesting, when Deleuze died, the obituary that Derrida wrote for Deleuze very much fits with Bruno's scheme, because he says, but I'm sorry, I'd have to look up the actual words now. He says, the philosopher with whom I was the closest was always Deleuze, because we shared this theme of difference, but I developed it in a different way. It's a strange thing to say on somebody's death, maybe, but captures a little bit the way Bruno wants to bracket that portion of the discussion. For Deleuze himself, and for the question of style and women and so forth that seems so central in this essay, and therefore in the discussion between the two of you, I think it's Catherine Malabou and Bruno's idea that there's some kind of limitation in associating women and style in the way that Derrida purports to do it in this essay, and that that limitation is connected to the problem of turning difference into a kind of school of thought that just perpetuates itself. I think maybe for the case of Deleuze, I just add this, that I think the problem of style itself, and in particular in the essay on nomad thought, which comes in this same period, it's really the problem of minority. It's the problem of writing a foreign language in a language. It's the problem of Kafka. It's the problem of writing a foreign language in a hegemonic language. And so the role of women and what women can do, how they write, it's much more that women themselves are a minority. They write as a minority in this sense of the term minority. And that's how I think this question, style and minority, is connected in Deleuze, perhaps afterwards, in this period after the 70s, but leading in a much different direction than the one that Bruno finds objectionable.
Let me just ask, I'm wrong about this undoubtedly, because I don't know that much about Deleuze. I mean, I read as much as my generation read Deleuze, but what does Deleuze say about Derrida?
What does Deleuze say about Derrida?
I mean, I've never really seen anything, so it's not like there was a great deal on the other side. I think they kept their distance in a sense because there would have been no particular line of, I mean, we behave like that towards colleagues whom we like, but with whom we really do not share intellectual presuppositions. I think one should, I mean, if one thinks of the atmosphere of the École Normale in those days, of course, you're young, but, there was a necessity to acknowledge that I am an ally, and I can think of people. So it seems to me that we should keep that in mind. Second of all, I think it is also true that Derrida, I mean, this Éperon is not representative of Derrida on women, and I do not really think that the idea of style, being woman, etc., that this is something that Derrida picks up on and keeps on developing on. No. It's the question of gender is always there, and this is right after Glas. No, right before, yes. Glas is published in 74, but of course Glas is all over the place. But this business, which I actually write in that early essay about, the business of not being able to catch the mother. This is, I'm not saying that this is a glorious topos. This is also a fairly common one. But on the other hand, and Derrida never liked the fact that I thought Asier Jabbar had written much more interestingly on this than he did, although the stuff about Elle, the mother as a big L blank, etc., rhetorically that was very persuasive, but I don't think one can just kind of somewhat positivistically identify Derrida with saying woman is style, etc., and say, look at essentialism, etc. I think that's a misreading. One can, I mean, not that I cared, like you, but I think one can look at the rhetorical care with which all of this is presented and see that he's not an idiot. I mean, to essentialize this as woman, as style, I mean, it would really be a killer. I mean, the problem with Malabou, whom I certainly respect a greatly, very smart person, is that these folks niche market him. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think I go to Derrida for my feminism. After a certain point, I mean, I was even when I was reading this stuff, I say in this piece, which you are kind enough to endorse, that when Derrida is talking about the positions that you can find in Nietzsche, positions in the psychoanalytic sense, that the final one, he's wrong. And I'm careful to point out how I believe he was wrong. I may be wrong or right myself. You can check it out, because I give footnotes. But on the other hand, what I don't say is that he's essentializing woman because he says the style is woman, etc. No, this is a reading. And also the idea that Derrida is kind of essentializing difference. I mean, the man wrote a great deal. It shows that you don't read him with any sort of sympathy, as you don't like him. But I don't particularly worship him or anything. He's not my teacher. But on the other hand, if one looks at the politics of friendship, where he's talking about women as honorary men and so on and so forth, there's a great deal of understanding there about genealogy and citizenship and so on and so forth, which is quite different from this early piece. So it seems to me that he never is comfortable with, and I also talk in that, in another essay that I asked you to read, about the pursuit, wanting to catch the mother, where he picks up on, I think, an unfortunate kind of topos again, of the mother as blood and the father as name and therefore death. And there's a very interesting analysis of Freud's study of one of his analysands dreaming of the dead father, which Lacan actually comments on, and one could actually make those connections, which I'm not going to, but it does seem to me that it would be a mistake to suddenly say that you cannot do anything with as a feminist with Derrida, because that's really not the point. The point is that there are things in deconstructive methodology, which the fact that it's not fashionable anymore doesn't particularly bother me. I mean, I didn't choose it because it was fashionable, and I certainly is not going to leave it because it's not fashionable. It's good that it's gone. It now is. But I will say one thing, that in terms of what you can do with deconstruction, the place is not confined to either difference or feminism. It really is, as he says in The Principle of Reason, that it's in order to get these suggestions somewhere, you have to step outside of the academy. And there is and another point that needs to be made is that Derrida deeply liked Hegel. It's not the situation of Hegel and Heidegger in Derrida are not the same. It's not possible to say that he had the same kind of contempt for Hegel, because finally he refers to Heidegger as the philosopher who never, in fact, was democratic at all. The man even, not even the philosopher, etc., etc. But no, Derrida is extremely keen on the Hegel of science of logic and phenomenology, I would say. So I just wanted to get these things said. I don't think we want to make him into, I mean, there is, after all, not just Derrida and Deleuze, but Badiou and Deleuze, Badiou and Derrida. And to an extent, I think the problem with Badiou's construction of a very kind of Derrida who's always essentializing and making these mistakes, etc., I don't think that's the way one wants to read Derrida. It's true, he's a troubling writer if he is read in this kind of a way. But it's not. I think Derrida should be given some credit for not being a fool. You know, it's this essentializing of woman as style, etc. No, that's he certainly one can object to that one. And as for Deleuze and Derrida, neither of them wrote about the other. This is a fact. Anyway, I went on for very long. Go ahead.
No, we have 4, 5 more commentaries. We will take them together if you want, and then we continue the conversation. First is Emily, then Tricia, Babette, Astrid, and I think you also raise your hand.
No one else says anything that I was going to say already. So me say.
Well, and John?
No, no.
No, okay. Emily, please. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that I've been going to Derrida more and more for, if not feminism, something to do with rethinking gender ontology. And I think he does more for this than almost any thinker. I've been giving a seminar this term on the whole problem of différence and then, or difference, différence, and sexual difference. And it seems to me that you cannot have any notion of the whole problem of genos, or a neuter sexed identities, or plural. You can't think this without difference, in my view. It's this signature of being, and this is the critique he makes in the Geschlecht essays. So I think there's an absolutely crucial relation between Derrida and gender. It may not be to do with Nietzsche and style, I agree with you, and I think you coined the term strategic essentialism in other ways, which in a sense deals with the problem, right? I mean, to me, you settle some of the essentializing problems of Derrida with that construction, which goes well beyond anything narrowly
I should just point out that in Alabama, Derrida insisted, I was sitting there, that it was he who had really thought of it.
Oh,
so,
okay.
I mean, he really, no, but carry on.
Well, I'm not going to carry on because I know there are other questions, but I would just say that the whole problem of priority and where we've moved to now, which is the question of the sexing the brain, or sexing pronomially beyond the binaries, can't be really thought without, in this, if there's a genealogy, it's really différence, sexual difference, and then some of the issues that Malabou picks up from Derrida, which is how do you know, Heidegger doesn't sex Dasein, and that's a project. If being, or if genos as species isn't rethought in terms of the mark of sexual difference, but that's taken away from sort of stereotypes about masculine and feminine. It's moved way into pluralizing the sexing of, in a sense, either ontology or of species. So I would just sort of throw that out.
Tricia?
Is this on? So I wanted to, Emily, thank you for that comment. I wanted to go back to the idea of sexual difference, because, I mean, sexual difference is for Derrida something, he always says, la différence sexuelle, s'il y en a, if there is such a thing. It's always, you know, in that hypothetical condition. So how do you think sexual difference and woman in Nietzsche, if you're in parentheses in this if, and also think of the title of Éperon, which is spurs, but what do spurs do? They move horses forward. I mean, as a horseback rider, I'm very conscious of that fact. It's a generative force, a spur. So a spur is also something, I mean, Derrida is also using the figure or looking at how sexual difference galvanizes and generates difference. For example, I mean, that is the analysis of Geschlecht, is trying to think of how, in fact, might sexual difference, and he's never saying it does, but it's might sexual difference, the lure of sexual difference, also galvanize the difference between the ontic and the ontological. Looking then at Levinas, he's also looking at, you know, the introduction of sexual difference as a philosophical theme, and how that certainly generates another figure among others. I mean, so he's constantly interrogating, you could say, the lure of sexual difference. And if you look at his essay Fourmi, you see he's also postulating la différence sexuelle s'il y en a, if it is, there is such a thing. Elle est lue, elle est lisante. It's something that she reads, and elle est lisante. She's, what's the, reading. So it's in some ways both an active something that you identify, like woman in Nietzsche, and you are also read by that figure itself. So it's inscribing, you know, as well as being inscribed. So I think there's this odd, you know, way in which the veil or the figure or the cut goes both ways. And I just wanted to, you know, make sure that when we hear this, it's also at understanding the risk, you could say, of that, introducing that cut into philosophy and into philosophical discourse, that Derrida is permitting also to kind of introduce, as he does both with Nietzsche and with Levinas, whom he's, you know, greatly indebted to in a certain way. Or in any case, and I remember at one of his seminars also him saying something like, he didn't really like the word gender. I mean, we're speaking about gender, and we do that quite a bit nowadays, but it's not something that he was very comfortable with, nor did he like saying he, she, kind of in a sentence. And French can avoid this in its own way by its neutre, you know, its figure of the neuter, which we don't have in the same way, in the same, you could say, cultural way. And I remember in someone who was saying, you know, why should there be two genders? You know, why not more than two? Which in some ways was very prophetic to the ways in which, you know, the very idea of gender, and in some ways its relationship to the sexual or to sexual difference. He certainly never said the sexual in the way that somebody like Lacan or even Lyotard would think of that. I think that's all I have to say.
I must say one small thing. You see, there is a certain kind of, I think you'll agree with this, unacknowledged phenomenological feeling that these people have. You know, it's the same way in which Marx says to the scandal of American leaders, there is no such thing as capital, you know, like s'il y en a. There's no such thing as labor. Labor even. Why? Because, of course, anybody who's kind of, you know, in a phenomenological without being Hegelian will think this. It's forms of appearance. It looks like something else. It's multiple in that way even. I mean, we don't think in that way. That's the problem. We think, you know, s'il y en a is some kind of a ontological non-commitment, etc. No.
And as though it were rhetorical. I mean, this is the problem. As though it were simply a question of style and rhetoric. But to what extent does style and rhetoric then engender, you know, that phenomenological possibility, or sexual difference itself engender that phenomenological possibility? I mean, that's then the double bind.
Babette?
John, would you mean just...
Thank you both very much. This was a wonderful presentation. I am particularly intrigued by both the effort to talk about appropriation and that's very intriguing because it's almost inevitable that we do so, because we are already sitting here, all of us speaking in the mouths of others. And so that happens rather commonly among male professors and whatnot is and almost goes without saying. It's unavoidable, and I appreciated Professor Bostiel's very careful way of making that point by referring to an Italian, and it's also sometimes the case that we don't quote Italians enough, so I thought, yay, that was very nice. But what I'm wondering and moved by is the positional question that Professor Spivak made, and that was with reference to Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's avowal that he would not publish, and I thought that was very nice use of that, die Zukunft unserer Bildungsanstalten. So for Nietzsche, what is the future of our educational institutions? And he gave those lectures. Now, the problem there is that style is probably the most pernicious, the most complex in what Nietzsche is doing. It's almost impossible. Someone who's an outsider in Nietzsche studies, and no one paid attention to him, which is the fate of many people, translated these texts, and they're almost unreadable, that particular translation. And the reason is because he didn't understand what was going on in what Nietzsche was doing, in the context out of which Nietzsche comes, the whole idea of a duel, the ridiculous character. But there's a backstory, and the backstory for Nietzsche is his own frustration as a teacher. There's a reason this man took early retirement. He hated teaching. He didn't hate teaching as such, but he hated the fact that he could not really grasp the idea, which was required of him in Basel, because it's a very Swiss thing, that it would be useful for students to learn classical Greek, and that this would make them, as classical gymnasium are supposed to do, excellent human beings, ready for anything, ready to conquer the world, as Nietzsche once wrote in a later little letter. But that question for him was exactly not self-evident and exactly not one he had a ready answer to. He was sure that it was not the case after teaching for 10 years, that in fact that it would have any such benefit. And he was sure of that almost immediately, because he didn't see why it would do that. That is to say, why learning Greek, of all things, when, remember, there is no KSA, pardon me, not KSA, Kirkgrave Schofield. There is no translation available. There's no deals. He was supposed to work with deals, but deals didn't finish until 1903, so there's nothing. All you have to do if you're reading Greek is read Greek, and in order to read Greek, you have to read Greek, and maybe there's some Latin, but you have to read Latin first. So the idea that students doing this could become proper Swiss gentlemen, this for him made no sense. So what he writes about there is actually to throw a glove down to the entire educational institution and say, it isn't going to work. Indeed. So it's not as if you learn, you will become a good revolutionary or a good citizen or a good anything. It's that the entire assumption of our educational institution makes no sense. But why publish that?
Yes, there is that sense also, but that comment is included in this, and I didn't have the time to read it. These lectures given, so this is the second, the other protocol. These lectures given by an academic to academics and students on the subject of studies in the university and secondary school amount to a theatrical infraction of the laws of academicism, etc., etc. So he does note that second protocol, other protocol as well. I felt that I was asked to speak for 15 or 20 minutes, and I had kind of taken all of this up. No, he's completely aware that we have to look at exactly the two things that you have spoken of. But what then he notices is that it's not just that theater of the destruction of the gymnasiums and the university are not just about what you and I agree on.
We agree, but I don't think the theater is relevant for Nietzsche. I think that that's where what you spoke about so eloquently and so well, about the need to begin to read, which is what Nietzsche was also deeply concerned with as a philologist, comes in. I don't think it's about the theater as such. I think the theater is the device, like the bone, you know, that the poet throws the reader. The theater is the device that confuses us, but that's not what Nietzsche's doing. He's really concerned with a real question here. He means that. And for me, the question would be to begin to understand what ultimately is behind posing that question.
We should talk about this outside because it's so interesting, but I'm taking up time after each question, and that's not correct. Carry on.
Yes, I just, thank you very much. I just wanted to add that, in fact, I think, too, that style for Nietzsche is an extremely complicated and important question, and it has to do with the fact that only through style he got, you know, the possibility, or could open up a possibility to change or to handle with forces. And I mean, you, Patricia, brought already in, you know, the concept of force, and this is what I just wanted to ask you, what I missed a little bit in your Bruno, yeah, in your presentation of what deconstruction could be, because for me, at least, when I began to read, you know, Derrida in the early 90s in Germany, I had to defend him, for sure, and but I did it very gladly, because for me, as a women philosopher, or female philosopher, he opened up a possibility to think about a, you know, new division of forces. So what he was doing, for me at least, was not to just appropriate a position of women, but to open up to think in a totally new way, you know, of the, what you also already mentioned, of the sexual difference, la différence sexuelle, et pas les différences des sexes. And I think this is a form of a possibility of critique which is connected to a understanding of thinking, in which thinking really is, you know, not to separate from the question of words, of language, of style, and of the question of forces, or of force. And that's why I think there are a lot of female philosophers who are very happy to have had, you know, Derrida and Deleuze, who opened up a possibility to read the text of Nietzsche in a really new way. Just what I wanted to add.
So one last comment, and then we will. Oh, you want to say something?
This is just a footnote to what others have said, but I just, along the lines of not recognizing what I'll call the Malibu version of Derrida, which I don't recognize, the one that was portrayed in Bruno's talk. This is the footnote. One of the things that struck me was the comment that in his reading of Nietzsche, he kind of addresses the style, but not the, among other things, the ontology, or the, you know, the, it made me think, unrelated to Nietzsche, but directly, I think, on point, in a very subtle and, I think, wonderful way that I haven't seen played up much. In the essay Cora, where he sort of performatively engages the question of the Cora in Plato and its relationship to being and so on with gender and with language, by saying, well, I'm just going to call her Cora. I'm not going to call it the Cora. And so he, at the same time, engages it in, again, like in gender, in alterity, in and so on. And it's just this. It's one of my favorite moves of his, if you'd like. That it strikes me as just completely inconsistent with his notion that gender for him is something that is related to this sort of the veil over truth and whatnot. That's all. That's all I need.
Can I add a little something? So, two things maybe. But on this question of essentializing and on the conversation we've been having, I think the difficulty here is the layeredness of this, of the work, in the sense that we're dealing with kind of Nietzsche's texts on women, Derrida's reading of Nietzsche on women, separating the content, the words from the analysis of the words, from the languages of both, right? I mean, the languages of Nietzsche and then the languages of Deleuze, to come at this. And ultimately, I think I agree with Patricia about the kind of substantive intervention, right? But then what at least when I read and reread Les Éperons, what nags at me is the flirtatiousness of certain language uses in the development of the analysis that then, in French in particular, and Bruno, you picked up on some of them, but they're a little bit all over the text in French. There's this flirtatiousness that kind of feels as if it assumes a heterosexual sexualization of the feminine object. Okay, and it's that. It's almost as if, you know, one would want to kind of rewrite these passages or something, or kind of cleanse them a little bit, or make them 2017. You know what I mean? Because they just feel 72, right? And it's that. But then I think that there could be a way, possibly today, to try and filter it in a way, almost as if, yeah, it's that flirtatious language that's woven into it that then, is it possible to, it's almost as if you'd like to peel that off the text and then just have the text itself, which doesn't function. It seems it doesn't function that way.
It's a desire of for a certain kind of reading. It's not 1972 and 2017. Yeah. Believe me, I mean, you know, you would narrativize it in that way, and that's good too. That, as you were saying, kind of teleological. We've gone beyond that. You can't peel that off. What would you find inside? Did you like that thing about faked orgasms in my early piece? Because you see, that relates to what you're talking about. The desire is to peel it off so that you can get to the truth. But that's not what we are dealing with here. And I will say also the Cora thing, which is so nice, it's because something, and it's not inconsistent, because that's where I began, that's why Patricia was talking about Geschlecht, and so was Emily. It's the pre-propriative, that's the Cora. Yeah. And, you know,
the matière.
Huh?
The matière.
Yeah, well, not even. Not even. I mean, you know, I don't know if, you know, I actually read through the Timaeus from the first word to the last, just to see, because everybody just quotes that Cora. It's really quite a bogus type book. You know, I mean, there's just amazing kind of pseudo-scientific nonsense, but especially also about women. And so the Cora, if one actually sees it in the whole book, it's quite unlike other Platonic texts. One sees that the fact of Kristeva picking it up and then Derrida correcting her, as it were, because she was inhabiting it too much, and then going to the pre-propriative, it's not inconsistent. That's the, and it's not Hule or matter or anything. It's none of those things, and it's pre-propriative, which is basically a very strong point. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be really talking about all of this after such. I don't teach this stuff anymore, but it's wonderful. Thank you.
Bruno? Well, I mean, I think that in a sense I was trying to get away from many of the debates to which I'm being brought back, which is, my argument was not about the essentialism, the disavowed essentialism in Derrida's text. It was also not really about the association of style and woman. I was assuming that we're going to sort of have gone beyond that. We have read many of the criticisms that have been made of this argument that put the text in its context. I wanted to draw attention to the novelty that was, must have been quite striking at the time. But then I wanted to bring it into that debate, which he seems to avoid, which is ontological, which is about the status of difference and difference. And in a sense, I didn't come to this, but my suggestion would be is that other tone or style that he, in a sense, bypasses, which is the genealogical style. Because Derrida, in many occasions, says that he doesn't like to be drawn into filiations, genealogies, genesis, and so on. Autobiography or autobiography, yes, but genealogy is not so much. Because there's sort of fraternal, filial trajectory that he wants to displace. So my question is more, can we write a genealogical history of the becoming dominant of difference as the assumed postulate with which we attack, criticize, or admire correctively Derrida's text from 1972? That's my basic question. This is not an attempt to sort of chastise him, punish him, say that he's essentialist. No, I mean, I've been reading, I'm writing currently sort of that type of genealogical account of the notion of différance, in conjunction also with Althusser's exactly simultaneous notion of décalage, discrepancies, which both Derrida and Althusser are using off of each other. They both, in a sense, write that they want to almost go as far as to accept the notion of their colleague working next door in the same space of Rue d'Ulm. But there comes a point, beginning, let's say, 1957 with Heidegger's text on identity and difference, in which we see a complete flip around. I'm also not interested in fashions and seeing, oh, the fashion is over. And there might be something of that in Catherine Malabou's take on Derrida. Oh, the time is over, now it's my time, it's a time of plasticity. But I'm more interested in the real work of thought to understand how that turnabout, which involves the relation to the dialectic, to development, to uneven development, and how we go from development to uneven development, unevenness, discrepancy, and difference, which in a more originary sense, in the essay on 68, would be différance. Prior to, but of course not prior in any logical or chronological sense, but somehow that which makes differences possible. And in her second essay, Gayatri says, as a catachresis, woman might still be an improper name for that movement of difference, of difference. Now, I completely embrace that argument. I'm not trying to say that this is a misreading. I'm trying to, in a sense, understand the history of the becoming ahistorical of that postulate of difference.
But if you want to do something with it, and it really does go like that, the reason why Habermas, when he started working with Derrida, said he was a philosopher of praxis, whatever you want to make with that phrase, it's extremely useful if you think of the absolute need for acknowledgement of epistemological contingency, so that the philosopher subject, in fact, is aware already in that fin de l'homme. It's not really a question only of sexual difference. It is where sexual difference itself begins to lose its outlines in other kinds of heteronormativity being made autonormative and so on. It's a useful way of moving with it, is what I'm trying to say. This flexibility that acknowledges the possibility of the epistemologically contingent subject position. That's a deep thinking. In fact, the idea of the le différent in Lyotard, which we all feel it was a dynamite thing, it can be developed along, and whatever Deleuze and Derrida had, certainly Lyotard and Derrida had a lot of dialogue. And it seems to me that's the way to go. It's not this constant understanding of the thinking difference not perhaps leading to anything. And the essay that you so kindly talk about, the second essay, that is still 1987. There is a lot that's almost 30 years ago. But then one moves, those are beginnings, and then one goes somewhere else in the world when one begins to think about the absolute necessity for epistemological, the very dangerous losing of ground with epistemological contingency, where reason becomes a grounding error, because, if I may quote an unfashionable philosopher once again, which is Marx's idea of the material determining consciousness in a certain way. Obviously, one could argue that in many different ways, but nonetheless, this idea of the need for being able to inhabit the possibility of contingent epistemological positions, that comes from the idea of difference. It's not just about is there difference, etc. That's way beyond where he was. You know, that, and I would really like to leave that as what one has learnt in all these years of trying to see what in deconstruction remains and what is resisted by other ways of testing the theory. So the idea of ce qui reste, it's not just ashes. That's what I'm trying to say. This is what remains as negotiations that have no end.
Could I ask Bruno then? And it was towards the end of your intervention, you were suggesting the idea that a genealogical transformation, not just tracing it backwards, but looking forward. You were suggesting that even Derrida had thought a year later that there was going to be a different concept, or that it was going to lead to another concept, and you traced a little bit the immediate subsequent. But if we went along that route, where would we be today? Would we be anywhere today? I mean, what would it be that would be this genealogical continuity in the present right now?
Well, I don't want to sort of go too much. I mean, this is the question that I'm working on right now, but I think in that Zeichenketten, in this sort of chain of signifiers that Nietzsche also talked about, there is, it's not a question about passing fads or fashions, but Derrida suggests, and he of course performatively embodies this in his work, in which he sort of tests and experiments with a series of words that make these processes move: trace, writing, retreat, and so on and so forth. So, I'm interested in the arguments that are being used to move the displacement and the transfer of conceptual energies that happen from one concept to the other. For example, already in De la Grammatologie, Derrida writes, différence is also something else than finitude. Even though many people have sort of, there's tons of books. I'm writing currently a book on the jargon of finitude, so I'm fascinated by this. But Derrida is very keen on pointing out there is something, if we start talking about finitude in the Heideggerian sense, that loses out on the fact that more fundamental than finitude, which still seems to imply a reference to some infinite or a God, we need to affirm originary difference. Right? Difference is more originary. So we can see these shifts from finitude to difference. Finitude was the obsession in the early 60s, very much borrowed from Christian existentialists that Derrida was working on. One of his first seminars at the Sorbonne was called "Can we say yes to finitude? Peut-on dire oui à la finitude?" Because if we say yes to finitude, in a sense, we're canceling out finitude. If we say no, we might get trapped into a dialectic, which would bring us back to the play between the finite and the infinite. This is just one example in which finitude moves into difference. I'm trying to work out how many of these terms or words move into the logic of the trait, the trace, and the retreat, the retrait, the traitement, which is also a retraitement and a retracting of differences, and in a sense do what in traditional terms would be called history of ideas, but which I think, I hope is also a more material genealogy. Because yes, we can affirm the contingencies of intellectual production. But as with the contingent origin of capital, there's also a retroactive move that makes those contingent encounters necessary. The
So-
retroactive becoming necessary of these movements. And that's much more interesting from a material point of view, as a material history of those processes, of the retroactive becoming necessary, and seemingly ahistorical of contingent conceptual distinctions. That was, in a sense, what I was trying to point out, with the isolated concept of difference as it is used in 1972.
Okay.
You can say, yes, when you say, yes, we can say contingencies of epistemological positions, etc., that's where the deconstructive move would say, talking the talk is not walking the walk. See, that's what we are talking about. Of course, I can say anything.
But I would say the same, that Derrida can talk the talk and say we need to study the reasons why the same discourse in Nietzsche or in Heidegger can be used for reactive purposes and active purposes. He will say the same in 1987 in De l'Esprit about Heidegger. It's not the same to say that we have to study it and actually to perform and lay out, uncover what exactly it is. He says we need to study without excuses that which makes possible the Nazi uses of Nietzsche and
And
Heidegger.
see that it is not possible to study it without excuses either. I mean, I don't want to go on about this, but it really is, this thing is something that has to be coped with commonsensically by us teachers. That is to say, the possibility that just to be, yes, we can say the epistemological contingency. All right, say it. But that doesn't really mean that we are speaking from a position which takes that risk. It makes thinking and talking and teaching different. It isn't a question of fighting it out and my master's voice, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I would say. And, you know, and again, this is what I put on the table as what one has learned, not to do to its
But, okay, Bruno, I don't want to be the dog that just nags on your ankle, but so this is the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, very contemporary critical thought. So get me past 19... where were you? Décalage? Were you at décalage? Or
Well,
so okay,
keeps
that's
going,
70.
it keeps going.
70. We're in 78 maybe. I want to know, like, what is there now? Does différence then give us something right now? What would be the term, the mot? No, concept peut-être. I don't know. What would it be today that we could deploy, use, find?
Well, those are just examples, but I don't want to sort of. But I think today, you know, it sort of leads into questions of affect, but also not just affectivity in general, but the specific orientations and inflections, the shifts in the evaluation of certain affects. It has also to do with community. You know, texts like, this goes from the 1980s all the way to the present. You know, from the inoperative community to the coming community to the present question about the commons, the communization, community, the commune. So, you know, we're not stuck in you know, sort of the philosophies of difference in the 1960s and 1970s. But we were asked to talk about, you know.
I know I've talked too much. You know, I'm on the ethics committee of the World Economic Forum. And this World Economic Forum, they talk constantly about there being no difference between medicine and poison. And commune, and Stuart Wallace says to me, I know that I'm going to touch the woman in this world who's suffering most greatly. And I said, oh, Stuart, are you joking or what? You know, if there's no difference, there's a difference in language. So there's some kind of stuff you're never going to be able to touch. That's this idea of, you know, multitudes being made by globality and everything being a network society and people being in a commune, etc. Stop and think of what you're talking about. It isn't, I'm not here supporting Derrida, but it isn't as if these declarations of commonality by folks in a certain corner of the world really mean gain that much if you actually move into areas with some sort of respect for people who are indeed completely different because of the way they've been denied the right to intellectual labor and so on. It's all very well to talk about communality, but who talks about it? And I just really do want to say that you can go quite far with an idea without saying that it carries a trademark. It was 1970s Derrida. Just as one carries the idea of the phenomenological, what I was saying to Patricia, about this is this and this is that, and move, or the idea of metalepsis in Kant, the effect of grace, rather than accepting it as grace behaving in a certain way. These are ideas that remain useful for very long times, and probably other folks also had these ideas. They were not in a situation where they could, in fact, become so public. And I think we should think a little bit about, again, what remains, by checking it out rather than saying, today there's commonality. I don't want to be so much like an angry old lady, but I am, in a sense, an angry old lady.
Can I add a insight to your comment? I mean, I think that in terms of your project, Bruno, and the question of the genealogy, the place of sort of Derridian difference in this, the dominance or the whatever it is, arc of difference coming to the fore. I mean, I have been reading the translation of the 1964 seminar on Heidegger and the history of being, and it's really, I mean, it's where he sort of comes up with the word deconstruction, and it's about difference as historicity. I mean, and as the disruption in continuity. And I would very much say, in terms of any genealogy, including your genealogy of how we got from there to here to difference, I mean, the disruption in that continuity, that is what, and sort of tying it in with what I think what Gayatri is saying a little bit. What does it give us today? I mean, what I get from Derrida today is, like, I don't really care that much what everyone thinks everyone is now saying, right? Or that where we are today. Like, I'm not so worried about that, where we are today, because if historicity is disruption, then I don't feel quite so worried about, frankly, having read every single thing that everyone has said about everything before I come up with my own ideas or whatnot. So I would just throw that out as a thought about this project of genealogy. Derrida, I would say, is very much in your genealogical project as a critical moment, clearly along with a bunch of other people, about the sort of the rise of difference as a concept, and he is absolutely outside of it. I mean, he's both. And his genius is to be both. I mean, and to be. I mean, his fate is to be part of it, because all of our fate is to be historical and epistemol, contingent and so on. But his genius is to also be outside of it, and to sort of be able to. You can read him 40 years later, 50 years later. I'm reading his thing on Heidegger 40 years later, and 50 years later, and think, this is really helpful. So anyway, that's all.
Yeah, but like, I mean,
why don't we, just because our time is shortening dangerously, why don't we take one last comment from Patricia, and then you will wrap up.
I'll be very fast.
You too.
Okay. So I'm a little suspicious, Bruno, about the neutrality of genealogy, but I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. But one word that hasn't really been pronounced about, you could say, the generative possibility of deconstruction is also the question of justice. And what remains with deconstruction, and what remains even of Derrida's reading of Nietzsche? What kind of performative justice is there? I think that's a huge question that really continues to this day.
Okay. Now you have some minutes each to wrap up this session, if you wish.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to go to Tunisia tonight, and the cab is going to come at 9 o'clock at this door. So, please, I'll just run away. So, at any rate, yes, thank you so much for bringing up the difference between law and justice. This is a very important issue. It's just that there be law, but law is not justice. You cannot undo those kinds of, and I totally ignored that particular thing, the rapport sans rapport, with the things which are indeconstructible. They're not essences, but it is true that there are these kinds of responsibility and accountability and so on and so forth, the gift and etc. This is not just word-mongering. Once again, it's an extremely interesting line of thinking in terms of, I mean, I am, for better or for worse, an activist person. It's not an academic activist. And to an extent, I don't knock the academy, but the academy is a place which has its rules for presentation and winning arguments and so on and so forth. But I think what one wants to bring into this is what remains with this kind of the structure of thinking that's, as you said, it developed in I don't want to be too teleological, but on the other hand, it is true that 78 was not where it ended. I mean, this is what one feels with people like Fanon or, people like Gramsci. What would have happened if they had lived longer? You know what I mean? So, whereas Du Bois is a little bit different, right? And so, to an extent, it seems to me that that's what I'm trying again and again to put on the table. I'm not as smart and scholarly as many, many Derrida scholars, but to an extent, this is to take up that, just as Melanie Klein took up the days I used to say, if I may say this with great humility, that you are my Mrs. Klein. But at any rate, this was, I'm sorry. But nonetheless, you see, Melanie Klein took up the challenge of what Freud said about primary narcissism and said, okay, Freud, I'm going to go turn it into something I do. And to an extent, all that stuff in the principle of reason about, no, you've got to go out of just not neutralizing it. So that's why I was saying that the niche marketing of Derrida now is what really irritates me, and not just with Derrida. I said this, Surya, you've heard me say this about Bhima Krishna Motilal. All of these philosophers who wanted to push philosophy, push the frontiers of their discipline, somehow being put back into that kind of history. It seems that one should perhaps make a challenge of some sort there. And that's all that I was trying to say, and I'm very grateful to Patricia for bringing up the justice business, because that is also a kind of peculiar notion of related difference, which is extremely useful if you want to work at anything. Just last week, I was asked by Tushar Kandilal to speak to their 72 new workers in the field, and I said in non-deconstructive Bengali exactly what I'm saying now about the difference between and to an extent, transforming Romain Rolland's awful pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will into the difference that you just invoked by bringing up justice. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bruno, last
I mean,
words?
I'm happy to be what Avital Ronell calls a loser's son. So it's not about winning an argument. I mean, for one thing, I think if we are talking about the generative potential of deconstruction, the very fact that we're having this discussion and that different generations of people are still reading the same texts that some of you may have read the day that they came out, suggests, of course, that we are engaging in strict complicity with these texts. Now, I'm not interested in sort of policing these texts, even though sometimes it feels as though it is very difficult to formulate different takes or attacks on these texts without being considered an ignorant outsider or somebody with the pretension of being an all-knowing outsider. So I'm writing this sort of difficult from a different position, in which the book that I'm writing will probably have no happy readers, because my leftist friends have no patience for Derrida and Heidegger and claim that I might be becoming kind of a closet deconstructivist. And people from the deconstructive cycle will have no patience for my rash sort of, rush to conclusions, right? But I still think, going back to that seminar, 1964-65 seminar, I mean, I spent weeks studying that seminar. And so I think this is also a gesture of real engagements with the text. This is not about winning arguments. This is about trying to think through this problematic. And I think you're kind of right about saying Derrida is very much part of this genealogy, but at the same time, he himself stands outside of it.
His text does.
The text does. And in part because he wants to raise the, he doesn't use the term condition of possibility. He's already questioning the notion of transcendental is not really valid anymore. But nonetheless, that which makes historicity possible, and the conclusion will in fact be the thinking of difference, the disruption of difference open up historicity as such. But from that point of view, the disruption of difference as that which opens up historicity, and with all due respect, the empirical research that you so underscore has no place. And Derrida is extremely scornful in some of those texts, even in Eporius, in Aporie, of those empirical or historical. It suffices to look at the Derrida-Foucault polemic,
Why do you find
which
him
is
scornful of empirical research?
of the historical research. When he uses terms like, there's something naive about the way in which the historians talk about the experience of death in the Middle Ages, Ariès and others. He will not use those terms of naive or idiotic when he talks about Heidegger. Heidegger is in a sense preserved from this, particularly in his 64-65 text, in which he says, we have to remonter en deçà. Marx, he doesn't use Foucault, but Marx, for example, is not able, even in spite of what Heidegger says in the letter on humanism, that Marx went further than Sartre and Husserl to think history in the terms of alienation. Even Marx remained ultimately stuck in a subjectivist voluntarism and sort of a material productivism. And therefore, he is not capable of remonter, of going back. Descendre, he uses all these ontic metaphors to talk about that which opens up historicity. So from that point of view, I am interested in studying how this logic works, and to engage with it. But I also want to draw the attention to the point where that type of argument suddenly comes in, associates itself, and wants to insert itself. This is at 64-65. Next door, Althusser was talking with the Althusserians in preparation of reading Capital. Derrida was very upset, according to Balibar, that nobody of the Althusser seminar came to listen to him, because he felt that Althusser and Derrida were doing the same thing at the same time. They asked the radical question about historicity, the historicity of history, from within a decentered understanding of the structure. And yet, at that time, they could not be on the same page. The recommencement of Marxism with Althusser, a deconstruction of metaphysics with Heidegger, Derrida and Althusser, even though they share the same vocabulary. And these terms, l'écriture décalée et décalante, he will still say in position about what the double writing of deconstruction is. So, new generations of people are going back to many of these texts. I think there is nothing but an acknowledgement of strict complicity. But also, yes, différent, with a D, which I think is productive and generative. And seeing, are there also points where what may be extremely generative in many ways also turns or creates blockages, or points in which there is no longer dialogue possible with the historical, with the genealogical, with the materialist.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our guests. Thank you very much for this memorable session. As you know, our blog is always open to your comments and questions and thoughts in general. Next installment is on Hélène Cixous, and it will be, if you can believe it, Nietzsche 12-13, and that will happen on April 13th. So you are all invited to come as always. Thank you very much.